Not every beginning of humanity took place on solid ground. Some of our earliest chapters vanished before anyone ever had the chance to carve a single mark into stone. When we look at the few thousand years of recorded history, it's easy to forget that human beings have existed many tens of times longer than that. The gap between those two numbers feels like a dark corridor. Something is there. We sense it. Yet the light we hold today is not strong enough to reveal its full shape. And from that shadowed hallway, an old question returns. On the lands now drowned beneath the sea or erased by ice, did communities once exist that were far more complex than we imagine, only to fade away, leaving behind nothing more than faint traces? During the age of ice, sea levels rose and fell like the deep breaths of the earth itself, uncovering vast plains, then swallowing them again when the ice melted. Each time the waters rose, places where early humans walked, traded, camped, and lived disappeared from the map. All we have now are scattered fragments, a stone structure out of place in the timeline, cave paintings far ahead of their era, a continent like Sunda that left no cities behind, or the old stories shared across cultures that never met. Stories speaking of a time before the Great Water came. This journey is not meant to deliver conclusions. It is an invitation to listen to what remains beneath thick layers of time, to the footsteps worn faint, to the ideas that were never written down. We will move slowly, gently, imagining the worlds that may have existed before the ice retreated and the seas advanced. Worlds quiet, but never truly nameless. And when that door finally opens, what surprises us most won't be shocking discoveries, but the familiar things we once overlooked, the small signals of the past lying right beneath our feet. So take a slow breath and walk with me into this journey, together with historical storytell. When the last ice age, stretching from about 70,000 to 12,000 years before the birth of Christ, wrapped the earth in a sheet of ice thick enough to freeze nearly every movement, humans didn't simply struggle to survive. They began shaping the first threads of abstract thought, quiet seeds that would one day grow into civilization. In the long, unbroken nights of those deep winters, they looked up to the sky to sense the seasons, read the tracks of animals pressed into frozen ground, and shared fire and meat to make it through nights cold enough to take any life. The old image of primitive humans no longer fits what they left behind. In ancient caves of Africa, objects dating from 90,000 to 70,000 years ago open a doorway into a complex spiritual world. Pierced seashells strung into necklaces, stone pieces engraved with balanced geometric patterns, and fine red pigments ground for painting skin or tools. These were not marks of simple survival. They were attempts to tell something, a story, an identity, a belief. And that need to express, to mark meaning, is one of the earliest signs of symbolic thought. From Africa, people slowly moved into West Asia, then Europe, and eventually reached Australia. Each group followed narrow corridors of warmer climate, traveled along rivers, crossed icy grasslands, and carried with them knowledge passed from generation to generation. Some lived by hunting reindeer, others by reading the tides of the sea, others by sheltering in wind-carved cliffs. But they all shared one thing. They gathered understanding bit by bit, like layers of memory stacked across tens of thousands of years. Civilization did not begin with agriculture or the wheel. It began with the ability to think beyond immediate needs, a carved mark on stone, a bead buried with the dead, a streak of color on a cave wall. Each sign tells us they were already building a shared memory for their community. Around 20,000 years before the birth of Christ, when the ice retreated and revealed new coastlines and valleys, humans did more than migrate. They carried with them a reservoir of understanding, refined across countless generations. How to read the land, how to share food, how to keep fire alive, how to follow the movements of the sun and moon. These small things became the foundation for the more complex societies that would come later. And when we look at the tiny stone tools and faint engravings left behind, we begin to understand. Anywhere people adapted deeply and passed knowledge forward, there was already the quiet pulse of a kind of civilization, even if it had no name. From that realization, the journey leads us south into the heart of Africa, where ancient engraved lines force modern science to rethink the origins of the human mind. If we want to find the deepest roots of symbolic thinking, the very thing that lifted humans beyond raw instinct, we have to look towards southern Africa. At Blombos, Pinnacle Point, and the long chain of coastal caves stretching for hundreds of kilometers, communities who lived between 100,000 and 70,000 years before the birth of Christ left traces that no longer fit the old idea of primitive humans. Their spiritual life, their sense of aesthetics, and even their social organization were far more refined than modern science once imagined. At Blombos, a stone engraved with geometric patterns, more than 77,000 years old, shows a mind already capable of abstraction. The balanced, repeated, intentional lines feel almost like an early system of signs. Nearby, bead strings made from pierced seashells, dated to over 100,000 years, were more than decoration. They were markers of identity, a language of belonging and connection. Their understanding of the sea was equally remarkable. They knew exactly when to enter the caves during low tide to gather shellfish, how to sort safe shells from dangerous ones, how to store food by season, and most impressively, how to use fire to heat-treat stone. That process produced thin, glass-sharp blades, the ancestors of later microlithic technology. In the sediment layers, cracked bones show the same processing method. Piles of shells sit in organized clusters, and charcoal lies exactly where hearths once burned. It's as if their routines followed a familiar rhythm passed down without interruption. This speaks of a community with roles, with shared memory, and with traditions that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. What makes Southern Africa extraordinary isn't only the skill, it's the continuity. From 160,000 to 60,000 years before the birth of Christ, despite shifting climates, advancing and retreating seas, and changing food sources, these communities continued carving symbols, refining their tools, and using red ochre as a ritual language. Such persistence can only arise in a culture stable across many generations. When we look at the dyed shells, the deeply cut stones, the tiny beads, we see more than craftsmanship. We see awareness, a sense of beauty, of belonging, of wanting to leave something that outlasts daily survival. And once a community begins to leave marks, the seed of civilization has already begun to take root. That heritage, the ability to read the world through symbols, traveled north with the groups who left southern Africa. Their footsteps carry us into the caves of Europe, where firelight shimmering on stone opened a new artistic era and challenged everything we thought we knew about the prehistoric mind. While the refined communities of southern Africa were nurturing the language of symbols, Europe was shaping a different chapter, a world locked in ice, yet illuminated by the quiet glow of fire inside deep caverns, from 40,000 to 20,000 years before the birth of Christ. Amid bending glaciers and frozen plains, humans entered caves not just for shelter, but to turn them into memory chambers, places where their inner world could be carved into stone. Inside the darkness of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, animals surge forward with a vividness that feels almost alive under flickering firelight. Horses, bison, cave lions, rhinoceroses, drawn with confident strokes, precise proportions, and purposeful composition. Yet between these majestic figures lie rows of dots, straight lines, repeating motifs like coded marks. Many researchers believe they may record the phases of the moon, migration patterns, or even an early kind of calendar, suggesting that cave art was not merely decoration, but a system of stored knowledge. Each painting shows a depth of observation that could not appear overnight. To capture the curve of a horn, the tension of muscles mid-run, or the rhythm of a moving herd, the artists had to watch for many seasons, hold those images in memory, then bring them to life with their hands. Behind every figure is a tradition, lessons passed from one generation to the next. Some caves reveal an intentional architecture, important images placed in the deepest chambers, where sound echoes more richly and firelight makes the figures flicker like they're in motion. This has led many scholars to believe visual rituals emerged here, experiences shaped by image, darkness, and flame, creating a spiritual atmosphere we can barely reconstruct today. A few patterns of aligned dots even match the position of the Pleiades cluster. If that alignment is real, then the artists of the Ice Age were not just gazing upward in wonder. They were already searching for order in the movement of the cosmos. These were the first quiet seeds of astronomy. There were no cities, no walls, no monuments, but something more vital existed, a shared way of remembering. They knew that life returned with the seasons, that moonlight shifted through cycles, that herds moved with reliable rhythms. They had begun to read time itself, a foundational leap for every civilization to come. And as the firelight in the caves faded, those painted walls led us to the edge of Europe, where Siberian winds cut like blades, and the land bridge of Beringia was opening a path into a new continent. There, extraordinary communities were preparing for one of the most important chapters in the human story. Leaving the firelit caves of Europe behind, we enter a place where harshness itself became the greatest teacher: Siberia and Beringia. From 28,000 to 12,000 years before the birth of Christ, this region stretched out like the final border of the world, a domain of ice, cutting winds, and winters that felt endless. Yet it was here, in a landscape that seemed unlivable, that humans proved just how adaptable they truly were. The people of Siberia did not walk through ice blindly. They knew when mammoth herds would leave the steppe, understood the moment snow softened enough to set traps, and remembered where hot springs kept water from freezing, pockets of life in the middle of a frozen season. Knowledge like this cannot appear within one lifetime. It was carried through stories, habits, and shared practices that survived across generations. Beringia, the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, was more than a crossing. At certain times, it was a world of its own, a vast grassland with tall shrubs and roaming giants. Here, families built homes from mammoth bones, animal hides, and driftwood, forming camps sturdy enough to withstand blizzards. Inside those shelters, they shared dried meat, tended the fire through long nights, and told stories that kept their collective memory intact. Their tools reveal remarkable precision. Light, balanced spear points designed to fly far and true. Without metal, they used stone, bone, and ivory to craft weapons capable of matching the demands of an unforgiving environment. This level of craftsmanship points to organized roles, shared skills, and traditions passed down carefully. The ice did not know it was about to open a doorway. Around 16,000 to 14,000 years before the birth of Christ, glaciers retreated, revealing an ecological corridor along Alaska's coast. Groups following migrating animals moved into this new land, spreading south through Alaska, then into Canada, and eventually across the entire American continent. It was a small moment in the Age of Ice, yet it sparked thousands of indigenous cultures that would later flourish across the New World. Looking back, we see that civilization does not only grow where there is farming or architecture. It appears wherever humans refuse to lose their understanding of the world around them. The people of Siberia and Beringia learned to read wind, ice, moonlight, and the subtle movements of the herds, a body of knowledge that quietly paved the way for the first journey into the Americas. And from this frozen realm, the echo of those early sky readers eventually meets another lineage far to the south, deep in the forests of Central America, where the Maya, many millennia later, would elevate that same skill of observation into something extraordinary, leaving us to wonder where their earliest instincts truly began. As the groups who once braved the cold of Siberia and Beringia slowly moved into the warmer lands of the Americas, they carried with them more than survival skills. They brought nights spent watching the sky, patterns of light they had memorized, and a way of reading the world through the rhythm of nature millennia later. When those memories settled into the rainforests of Central America, they formed the foundation of one of the most intricate cultures in human history, the Maya. The Maya did not appear suddenly, yet when their civilization entered its golden age, roughly between the years 300 and 900, their astronomy showed a level of mastery that feels almost uncanny. They calculated a 365-day solar cycle, tracked the delicate movements of the moon, and, most impressively, charted the complicated path of Venus with a precision that other great civilizations needed thousands of years to refine. It is hard to believe such depth could develop in a short time. It feels more like the culmination of a long, persistent thread of observation. At Uaxactun, Copan, and El Mirador, Maya temples were aligned with the sun at its zenith, with solstices, and with the cycle of Venus. Narrow window-like openings allowed sunlight to pass through at the exact moment the sun reached a specific latitude, turning architecture into an instrument for measuring time. Achieving this required continuous observation across many generations. Maya art and mythology are equally steeped in a sense of cycles, deities born from water, ages that rise and fall, worlds created and undone. The Popol Vuh, their spiritual epic, describes history not as a single line, but as a series of repeating eras. This has led many scholars to wonder why the Maya were so naturally inclined towards cyclical thinking. One detail makes the Maya feel older than their own timeline. Their sophistication appears early El Mirador, already thriving 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, housed massive pyramids, ceremonial complexes, and a fully developed astronomical system. There is no recognizable trial and error phase. The culture seems to arrive already carrying a refined body of understanding. This does not imply a lost civilization. Instead, it reminds us that human knowledge does not rely solely on writing. The people who passed through Beringia or followed the Pacific coast may have carried with them subtle insights about natural cycles, insights that were honed over thousands of years in the forests of Central America. And when you stand beneath a Maya pyramid, looking up at a night sky bright as a vast ancient dome, you almost hear an echo, the distant whisper of icy nights in Siberia, where their ancestors once read the heavens as a map for survival. From that echo, the journey moves eastward towards Sunda, a great continent that once existed and then vanished completely when the seas rose after the end of the Ice Age. From the deep forests of Central America, where Maya nights still carry echoes of ancient sky watching, our journey moves back toward the east, to Sunda, a continent once larger than 1.5 million square kilometers before it disappeared beneath rising seas. Between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than today, Sunda stretched out as a vast green landmass. Rivers wound through dense tropical forests, sustaining coastal communities whose memory ran deeper than what modern archaeology can easily reconstruct. Geological surveys beneath the seas around Java and Sumatra reveal old river systems, branching like veins. These traces describe more than a lost landscape. They point to an environment ideal for long-term settlement. Mild climate, abundant fresh water, and coastlines long enough for early exchange networks to thrive. In areas now completely submerged, stable coastal communities may once have flourished, places where dugout canoes, fishing traditions, and maritime knowledge linked groups separated by hundreds of kilometers. What remains on land, in Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and the highlands of Indonesia, are fragile but precious clues. Finely ground stone tools more advanced than many elsewhere from the same era. Shell beads strung into ornaments, carved motifs repeating familiar patterns. These remnants hint at a coastal culture with wide connections, a world where memory was kept not through monuments, but through small objects carrying spiritual meaning. The tragedy of Sunda unfolded at the end of the Ice Age. Between 14,000 and 11,000 years ago, sea levels rose rapidly. Like the hurried breaths of the earth-wide plains, became shallow seas, and shallow seas became ocean. People retreated from the sinking lowlands, taking their memories with them to the shores of what are now Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and even farther toward the Pacific. No written story records this moment, yet flood myths echo across Southeast Asia, India, and Polynesia, like distant memories of a world once drowned. Those who left Sunda carried more than tools and family. They carried habits of watching waves, winds, and tides. They knew how to read the ocean, and that understanding allowed them to travel farther than we might imagine. A culture does not disappear. It dissolves into the sea, then crystallizes again as new communities form along new coastlines. And from those mountain peaks that became islands, another journey began. They turned toward Sahel, the great landmass where humans had already crossed open ocean more than 50,000 years earlier. opening a chapter so ancient that even time struggles to blur it. When rising seas swallowed Sunda, we begin to see that many of humanity's earliest journeys did not start on land, but on the open ocean. Sahul, the supercontinent that once connected Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Tasmania, holds one of the oldest stories we know. Between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, humans crossed stretches of open water, tens of kilometers wide to reach it, that could not have happened by accident. It required boats, navigation skills, food storage, and a collective will strong enough to push people into the vast, unknown sea. Upon reaching Sahul, they encountered giant animals, harsh, dry plains, and climates utterly different from those in Asia. Yet, instead of turning back, they adapted so quickly that their rock art, on cliffs, on sandstone shelters, dates back more than 40,000 years, among the oldest artwork on the planet. These were not just drawings. They were a way of recording origins, animals, and unseen forces shaping their world. The cultural continuity of Australia's first peoples, stretching more than 50,000 years, is one of humanity's most enduring lifeways. The dreaming tracks, which describe the journeys of ancestral beings, are also maps, pathways through valleys, water sources, hunting grounds. Many of their stories about rising seas match geological records from 18,000 to 7,000 years ago, showing that oral tradition can carry memory across thousands of generations. Sahul's early inhabitants did not merely live in nature, they shaped it. They used fire to manage vegetation, open hunting corridors, and renew grasslands, one of the earliest examples of ecological engineering. Their technologies, spear throwers, boomerangs, sharp stone tools, show a mindset finely tuned to environment and function. But perhaps the most important moment was when they first pushed a boat away from shore. That was more than survival. It was imagination. A community only dares to cross an ocean when it has faith in something it cannot yet see. And that faith is one of the earliest seeds of civilization. The people of Sahul later spread across Australia and New Guinea, forming wide maritime networks and distinct cultural worlds. And as we follow the traces of their migrations, this long shoreline of memory leads us toward Doggerland, a once green plain in Europe, now lost beneath the North Sea, and another chapter in the story of civilizations erased by rising water. If Sahul reminds us of humanity's earliest voyages, Doggerland reminds us how fragile even the most flourishing landscapes can be. From 20,000 to 6,000 years ago, there was a vast plain between what we now call England and the Netherlands. Oak forests, marshlands, rivers, lakes, and herds of migrating animals so abundant that the ground itself seemed to breathe. But beneath that abundance was the quiet life of sophisticated communities, people who built complex riverside settlements long before everything was swallowed by the North Sea. For many years, Doggerland was little more than speculation. But when fishing boats began hauling up human bones, mammoth remains, polished stone tools, and wooden stakes that once formed the frames of houses, the past slowly surfaced. This was not the territory of wandering bands. These traces show communities that lived in stable groups, building homes along rivers, hunting seasonally, gathering berries, fishing at the estuaries, and collecting shellfish by the rhythm of the tides. As the climate warmed, sea levels rose, slowly at first. The people of Doggerland retreated little by little, adapting as their land disappeared meter by meter. But around 8,200 years ago, a major climatic event, possibly the sudden release of water from the Laurentide ice lake, caused the sea to rise far faster than anyone could adjust to Doggerland, vanished within a few generations, becoming the seabed we know today. The survivors scattered to England, Scotland, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, carrying with them skills, memories, and stories about the land that had drowned. Echoes of those stories may have blended into later Norse myths about a country lost beneath the waves, a faint resonance of Doggerland, though impossible to prove. When scientists mapped the North Sea floor with modern scanning technology, the ancient river systems appeared clearly, like the hidden veins of an old memory. They remind us that a complete world once stood there, and then disappeared without leaving cities or monuments, only humble traces of the lives once lived. And from Doggerland, another migration path bends toward the Pacific coast, leading to the pre-Clovis peoples, the ones who stepped onto the Americas long before the famous Clovis culture appeared. As Doggerland slowly disappeared beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, another branch of humanity moved in the opposite direction, following the long curve of the Pacific coastline. Long before the Clovis culture appeared around 13,000 years ago, other communities had already reached the Americas. They left behind quiet but consistent traces, as if telling a story that history never wrote down. The story of the pre-Clovis peoples. These groups did not reach the Americas by accident. They carried with them the knowledge sharpened over tens of thousands of years, migrating along the coasts of Asia, Siberia, and Beringia. The ability to read waves, predict tides, watch the stars, and sense the subtle changes in wind. Their path, the Pacific coast migration, did not create great cities, but it was lined with hunting spots, sheltered camps, and countless small memory stations, where experience was passed from one generation to the next. At Monteverde in Chile, the 14,500-year-old footprints of children pressed into ancient mud, the woven plant fibers, and the carefully used medicinal herbs reveal a community that cared for one another. This was not the life of scattered wanderers. It was the life of a society with roles, identity, and shared memory. Along the North American coast, whale hunting tools made from bone, heavy anchor stones used for net fishing, and finely polished spear points show that these people relied on the ocean more than the land. It is a kind of civilization we rarely call a civilization, yet it contains every foundation of one: organization, belief, environmental knowledge, and collective memory. Their silence in the historical record is not because they were insignificant, but because the ocean reclaimed the places they lived. After 12,000 years ago, rising sea levels drowned most ancient shore settlements. What were once thriving coastal villages now lie deep beneath cold Pacific waters, leaving only scattered tools, hearth ash, and shells, faint echoes of a world that has vanished. Some theories ask whether the pre-Clovis peoples ever interacted with distant migration streams, from Polynesia or maritime communities in East Asia. There is no definitive proof, but the rapid spread of ocean hunting techniques from Alaska to Patagonia makes the question hard to ignore. But the point is not to prove where they came from. The point is to understand that civilization can begin in places without walls, in places shaped by the rhythm of waves, and that same rhythm leads us across the Pacific to Japan, where the Jomon people left behind some of the oldest pottery on Earth, like memory etched into clay that time has never managed to erase. If the pre-Clovis peoples left behind traces so faint they now rest beneath the ocean, the Jomon culture gives us something far more durable: pottery. Around 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, while much of the world was still wrapped in the last chill of the Ice Age, the Jomon people of the Japanese archipelago were crafting vessels decorated with spirals and carved patterns unlike anything seen elsewhere. Their artistry wasn't a moment of inspiration. It reveals an aesthetic sense shaped slowly across many generations. The swirling lines flow like waves, the deep incisions echo the movement of sea winds, turning each Jomon pot into more than an object. It becomes a record of memory of their environment, their food cycles, and the ocean that sustained them. What makes the Jomon especially remarkable is their continuity. For more than 10,000 years, they lived in semi-sedentary communities, sheltering in pit dwellings that kept out the cold, hunting small game seasonally, gathering chestnuts and seaweed, and relying heavily on the rich fisheries along the coast. Deep, layered ash pits show that their settlements were not interrupted, clear signs of a stable society with tradition and long-held memory. But the Jomon were not just survivors. Many of their vessels are too elaborate for daily use, likely created for ceremony, authority, or symbolic meaning. This tells us they had a vibrant spiritual world where imagery carried weight equal to practicality. They left no writing, no cities, yet they held a tightly woven belief system passed down through visual forms. The Jomon world was not isolated. Small-scale exchanges across the sea, shell beads, flint, and crafted tools show they maintained a short-range maritime network linking islands and the northern Pacific coast. In this sense, the Jomon were not simply people of the forest and shore. They were one link in a long chain of ancient ocean cultures, stretching from East Asia toward the wider Pacific. When we look at a Jomon pot, we're not just seeing its shape, we're seeing time itself. Each carved line seems to hold a whisper from a distant age, and those whispers guide us farther south across the Pacific, toward Melanesia, where people would later build such wide-reaching ocean routes that the sea became a pathway, not a barrier. Leaving behind the spiraling pottery of the Jomon, our journey glides across the Pacific toward Melanesia, a region of thousands of islands scattered like memory markers on the ocean's surface. Here, people did not build stone walls or raise great cities. They built their civilization from the sea itself, from wind, from currents, from routes that only reveal themselves when you stand on a canoe and listen to the rhythm of the waves. For Melanesian communities, the ocean wasn't an obstacle, it was a map. They read the direction of the wind through their skin, distinguished watercolors with their eyes, felt the pulse of waves through the soles of their feet, and watched birds to gauge where an island hid beyond the horizon. Their knowledge wasn't written in books, it lived in the body, in the stories of elders, in journeys told and retold thousands of times. Archaeological sites in New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago reveal traces of complex societies. Large settlements, pottery decorated with repeating geometric motifs, and especially the Lapita culture, emerging around 3,500 years ago, whose network spread rapidly from Melanesia into Polynesia. Lapita patterns are so consistent across vast distances that archaeologists now see them not as casual trade, but as deliberate cultural expansion. Melanesian legends also preserve memories of lands that sank, of wide island chains taken by the sea. These motifs echo across Southeast Asia as well, forming a distant resonance with the memory of the lost Sunda continent. We cannot treat such stories as data, but the similarities are striking enough to make us wonder, were these tales the preserved echoes of ancient sea level rise, carried across generations on voyaging canoes? What makes Melanesia extraordinary is its spiritual life. Rituals, symbols, clan hierarchies, all of it weaves a mental map that runs parallel to the map of the sea. The paths of the ancestors aren't drawn with ink, they're spoken. Yet they're so precise that they guide sailors to islands invisible from shore, across expanses of open water. Seen from a modern perspective, Melanesia might be labeled pre-civilized. But with deeper understanding, we see that they held one of humanity's greatest secrets, the ability to preserve memory across the ocean. Their civilization was not written on stone, it was anchored to the water. And as their ancient canoes skim across the waves, our journey carries us westward, to the Gulf of Cambay in India, where submerged structures continue to challenge how we imagine the origins of early civilizations. Following the trail of ancient coastal cultures, our journey takes us to the western shore of India, to the Gulf of Cambay, which opens like a page of history blurred by water. Beneath the murky currents of the Arabian Sea, scanners have revealed strange straight lines, layered stone blocks, and shapes that look uncannily like the outlines of an old settlement. A few organic samples have been dated to between 9,000 and 12,000 years ago, early enough to make researchers reconsider the familiar timeline of South Asian history. To understand why Cambay sparks so much debate, we have to look back to the end of the Ice Age. When sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, Gujarat was not a coastline at all. It was a vast plain where braided rivers twisted together into a dense network. It was the perfect environment for long-term settlement, fertile soil, abundant water, and a climate stable enough for riverbank communities to thrive long before the sea rose and swallowed the land. In Indian tradition, stories of kingdoms taken by the sea appear far too often to be dismissed as coincidence. These myths cannot replace evidence, but their repeated motif makes Cambay a meeting point between archaeology, geological memory, and narratives passed down through thousands of years. On land around Gujarat, archaeology has uncovered supporting pieces of the puzzle: groundstone tools, coarse pottery, ritual fire pits, and signs of long-term habitation. These traces suggest real communities once lived here, organized, seasonal, and stable, not just wanderers leaving behind a few scattered artifacts. The main debate centers on the nature of the structures beneath the Gulf. Some geologists argue that rock in this region naturally fractures along straight plains, creating shapes that resemble foundations. But the repeated geometry, along with charred organic remains and human-associated debris mixed into the sediments, makes the idea of ancient occupation difficult to dismiss entirely. The important question is not whether Cambay was a lost city. The significance lies in the pattern it represents. During the post-glacial sea rise, countless coastal communities may have flourished and then vanished without ever leaving behind monumental stone structures. What remains are faint signals, hints that were quickly buried as the shoreline moved inland within just a few generations. Looking down into the waters of Cambay today feels like reading a manuscript that water has washed nearly blank. Only a few faded strokes remain, just enough to tell us a story once existed. And it is this suspended uncertainty that leads us to the next mystery to the northeast, Yonaguni, where submerged stone formations challenge archaeological imagination in an entirely different way. From Cambay, the journey takes us across the sea to Japan's Ryukyu Islands, where the water is so clear that sunlight seems to brush the ocean floor. Off the coast of Yonaguni lies a massive underwater formation whose beauty defies easy classification. Broad steps that look like staircases, stone faces so smooth that light skims across them like a blade, and angles so close to perfect right corners that they feel almost intentional. Yet the moment we come closer, that certainty dissolves. There are no shards of pottery, no traces of charcoal, no tools or artifacts, only stone. Every feature of Yonaguni could be natural. The sandstone here naturally breaks along flat plains. And yet, because the shapes are so geometric, doubt lingers like a whisper in the water. If Yonaguni were man-made, it would have been shaped when sea levels were much lower, at the end of the Ice Age or the beginning of the Holocene, when this area was still dry land. But that period lies far beyond any known stoneworking tradition in Japan. The idea is fascinating, but it requires a leap that archaeology is not ready to take. If it is natural, then we must accept that the ocean and its currents can sculpt forms that resemble architecture closely enough to trick the human eye. This is not impossible, but to explain the entire structure of Yonaguni, nature would need to be an extraordinarily patient, extraordinarily eccentric artist. The feeling of swimming around Yonaguni is what makes it truly striking. It does not look fully artificial, yet it does not feel entirely natural either. It sits in a liminal space, where instinct leans one way while the evidence remains silent. And sometimes that silence makes the question beautiful. It asks for nothing, only invites possibility. From Yonaguni, as the deep blue closes behind us, the journey carries us to another continent, the Bolivian highlands, where the stone blocks of Tiahuanaco pose a very different kind of puzzle, one that rises from the ground rather than the sea, yet still challenges what we think we know about the prehistoric world. Leaving the waters of Japan behind, the journey carries us across half the world to the Bolivian highlands, where Tiahuanaco sits in the thin air like a riddle without a final line. Unlike Cambay or Yonaguni, Tiahuanaco was never buried under water or ice. And that makes it harder to explain away as natural, because the stonework here is too precise, too consistent, to feel like coincidence. Huge andesite blocks weighing tens of tons have been cut into faces nearly perfect in flatness. Grooves and joints fit so tightly that a blade cannot pass between them. The famous H-blocks follow a clear modular logic, and scattered pillars suggest a layout with planning, something we usually associate with civilizations many millennia later. Mainstream history places Tiahuanaco between year 500 and year 1000 after the birth of Christ. But certain clues, patterns of erosion, alignments that seem to match astronomical points from the end of the Ice Age, and unusual sediment layers hint that parts of the site may have roots far older than the official timeline allows. No one is rushing to declare the entire complex the work of a lost super-civilization, because that would require rewriting the history of South America from the ground up. But the question lingers quietly. Why does such advanced stone craftsmanship appear in a region that shows no gradual build-up toward it? If this was simply the work of a late culture, why is the transitional phase, the period where techniques grow and mature, nowhere to be found? Perhaps Tiahuanaco is a palimpsest, a site layered over many eras, each generation building atop the remains of the one before, while the oldest layer faded long before written memory. Or perhaps, in the centuries after the great meltwater floods, a body of knowledge existed in the Andes and slowly dissolved as environments and populations shifted. The importance of Tiahuanaco is not in proving what date it belongs to. Its power lies in what it reminds us, a theme that has followed us since the beginning of this journey. Sometimes, knowledge appears fully formed, as if inherited from somewhere we have not yet learned to recognize. And from this windswept plateau, the path turns toward the Near East, where Göbekli Tepe, with its 11,000-year-old stone pillars, waits to challenge once more our familiar ideas about what a first civilization ought to look like. From the windswept highlands of Tiahuanaco, the journey draws us back toward the Near East, where, on an otherwise ordinary hill, Göbekli Tepe lies buried like a secret kept for thousands of years. Its T-shaped pillars, taller than a standing person, form circles across a dry, stony landscape, standing there as silent witnesses to a time when, according to earlier scholarship, humans should not have been able to build anything like this. Yet 11,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherer communities here erected a complex that forces the story of civilization to pause and reconsider itself. The mystery is not just the size of the stones, but the precision of the carvings. Foxes, deer, snakes, vultures. These figures are not simple depictions of wildlife. They speak a symbolic language of a community that had no writing system, yet clearly possessed a shared worldview. Even the craftsmanship alone, those deep, clean cuts in hard stone, reveals organization, cooperation, and a purpose powerful enough to bring scattered bands together. Göbekli Tepe raises a question few had imagined before. Did humans build temples before they built farms? For decades, history insisted that only after agriculture provided surplus and stability could people construct large monuments. But here, the sequence seems reversed. It may have been the need for shared ritual, for gathering, storytelling, and affirming identity, that pushed groups to stay in one place longer, perhaps seasonally. And once they stayed, they needed food, predictability, and planning. Agriculture may have sprouted not as a cause, but as a consequence. Even stranger, Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. After millennia of use, the builders did not destroy it. They covered it layer by layer, as if closing a chapter of themselves. No one knows why. To protect it, to end its era, or to seal something sacred in silence. But this act turned the entire site into a time capsule, each layer of soil a deliberate choice. To build Göbekli Tepe required many hands: stonecutters, transporters, planners, ritual leaders. It shows that hunter-gatherers were not drifting bands, but groups capable of coordination, memory, and a shared spiritual aim strong enough to surpass physical limitations. In these stone circles, we see humanity standing at a threshold, not yet settled farmers, but already possessing a spiritual life, vivid enough to cast the first long shadow of civilization. That moment opens the path to the Natufian culture, the people standing at the very edge between foraging and farming, where the great turning point of our species begins to take shape. From the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, the journey carries us down into the Levant, where, more than 14,000 years ago, the semi-subterranean huts of the Natufian people marked a turning point. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, humans began to stay. They were not farmers, yet no longer the fully nomadic hunters who moved with every season. They lived in the space between two worlds, and that in-between space became one of history's most important pivots. The Natufians built their homes near fields where wild barley and wild einkorn wheat grew thick. At first, they only gathered, but over time, as they noticed fallen seeds sprouting again the next year, they began to watch more closely, then gently intervene. Slowly, subtly, but enough to alter the future. There's no single recorded moment, yet the evidence speaks clearly. Sickles worn down in a way that only grain cutting can produce, grinding stones for processing seeds, and small storage pits dug into house floors, the earliest hints of food reserves. Their rituals shifted as well. In Natufian burials, strings of shell beads, animal teeth, and polished stone ornaments appear as signs that they cared about the memory of their community. The dead were arranged with intention, sometimes adorned with jewelry. A society that cares for its ancestors is a society beginning to see time, not just as repeating seasons, but as a long, unfolding river. Then came the Younger Dryas, around 12,900 years ago, a sudden return to cold, shrunken wild food sources and forcing the Natufians to choose. Revert fully to nomadism, or take control by planting intentionally to support their new settled life. Their decision, not entirely voluntary, but remarkably adaptive, carried humanity across the threshold into agriculture. The Natufians had no cities, no monuments, no carved temples, but they carried something more transformative, the transition itself. They were the bridge between two modes of living that had defined humanity for tens of thousands of years. And from that bridge, the familiar shape of civilization began to form. And as their model spread outward, modern science, with laser scans piercing forests, sonar tracing the seafloor, and ancient DNA revealing forgotten lineages, began to open a door back into stories time tried to hide. Leaving the valleys of the Natufians, our journey returns to the present, a time when humans hold tools that let us look deeper into the past than any generation before us. The past itself has not changed. What's changing are the layers of haze that once hid it. Light, sound, and even fragments of ancient DNA are peeling those layers back. Modern technology is opening a wide doorway, one that sometimes startles us by revealing how little we have actually seen. LiDAR, laser beams cutting through forest canopies, has turned jungles that once swallowed entire sites into clean, flat maps. Through it, the hidden Maya cities of Guatemala rise again in full shape. Raised roads, irrigation grids, plazas, fortifications, all so deeply buried that people living above them had no idea what lay under their feet. When a vibrant culture like the Maya can vanish completely beneath the trees, we begin to understand how easily older, quieter coastal communities could disappear without a trace. Beneath the sea, sonar performs a similar miracle. It sends sound downward and listens to the echo, drawing the outlines of ancient shorelines, lost rivers, and stone terraces that have slept underwater for thousands of years. Sonar brought Doggerland back onto the map. It revealed the puzzling formations at Cambay and Yonaguni. Whatever their origins, the message is the same. Much of humanity's story lies below the waves, a realm we rarely examine. In laboratories, ancient DNA reveals yet another layer. Migration routes once dismissed now appear clearly. Connections between groups separated by half the planet suddenly make sense. Communities once thought isolated turn out to share distant ancestors. Even when stories fade, bones still carry the path humans walked across time. Traditional archaeology has changed too. Pollen grains, microscopic ash, old sediment layers, satellite imagery. Every tiny clue helps expand the picture. Once we accept that most ancient coastlines are now underwater, and that half the planet was once locked beneath ice, silence stops, meaning nothing was there. It simply means we haven't uncovered it. Yet technology doesn't make history blurrier. It shows how many layers the ancient world truly had. And as the fog lifts, one question becomes almost inevitable. If a community existed before the Great Thaw, what traces could still remain in that long quiet? That question leads into the next part, not to claim certainty, but to explore carefully the kinds of signs that might linger after tens of thousands of years. As modern technology shines into the darker corners of the past, into places where old maps once ended in blank space, a quiet question suddenly becomes clear. If a community existed before the ice melted and the seas rose, what would they leave behind for us today? Not towering temples, not statues carved to defy time. If they ever lived, their traces may have slipped into silence so completely that they blend with nature itself. The first hints might lie in the shape of the land, a curve in the plains that feels too deliberate, as if a river had once been guided by human hands, a channel far wider than anything carved by chance. A stretch of coastline bent in a way that suggests intention rather than accident. These subtle patterns, repeated over generations, could leave faint marks, not large enough to be called monuments, but distinct enough to make us pause. Other signs might rest within the ecosystem, a layer of soil darkened by controlled fire rather than lightning. An abrupt change in animal populations that nature alone can't fully explain. A type of pollen buried in sediment that doesn't match the climate of its layer. These quiet signals don't tell a full story, but they hint at communities who once shaped their surroundings with care. Some traces don't live in the ground at all, but in stories spoken across centuries. Cultures separated by oceans describe lowlands swallowed by the sea, journeys forced by rising water, homelands lost in a single turning of the tide. Such motifs make us wonder. Are these coincidences of imagination, or distant echoes of a time when the oceans rose more than 120 meters after the Ice Age? It's also possible that what remains isn't material at all, but a way of understanding the world, reading waves for direction, reading the sky for weather, passing the rules of wind from voice to voice, instead of carving them into stone. These things cannot be dug up, yet they survive in communities far apart. When similar skills appear in places with no contact, sometimes they speak louder than a block of carved rock. There is another possibility, perhaps the most modest one, that nothing is left. Not because they never existed, but because time, ocean, and climate erase more than they preserve. A coastal community, living for tens of thousands of years, could vanish in just a few generations of rising seas, leaving not a single artifact behind. But absence is not proof of emptiness. It only reminds us that our tools are still too limited to read every story time has compressed. A strange curve of soil, a thin layer of ash, a recurring motif in distant legends. Each small trace opens the door to something larger, and from those small openings, a deeper question begins to surface. Perhaps our definition of civilization, built on stone, metal, and writing, is not wide enough to describe the worlds that rose and vanished before history began to keep score. When we gather the scattered traces, from thin layers of charcoal to puzzling stone formations, from old stories to seafloor maps, we start to see that the goal isn't to prove a lost civilization. It's to widen the way we look at the past. History isn't a fixed book. It is a reflection of how we interpret the world. When our perspective shifts, the pages shift with it, not because the past has changed, but because the light falling on it has. For a long time, people believed history moved in a straight line, from hunters to farmers, then clans, then cities, then empires. But new findings, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, Yonaguni under Pacific waters, the submerged structures at Kambay, and Göbekli Tepe standing on a dusty hill, break that neat line into branching streams. History looks less like a single river and more like a network of currents, crossing, splitting, disappearing, then resurfacing somewhere else. So asking whether a society existed before the Ice Age isn't about searching for a super civilization. It's an exercise in humility, accepting that what we see today is only what survived, and that what vanished may have been far greater. Accepting that human insight can bloom, fade, and reappear without leaving behind stone walls or monumental statues. The absence of evidence does not mean the absence of life. A few meters of rising water can hide thousands of years. A single flood can erase everything except a handful of spoken stories. A sudden climate shift can make entire coastal communities disappear like mist. What time chooses to preserve are often just fragments, scattered across soil, wind, and legend. Scientific imagination is not fabrication. It is the space where unanswered questions live. It doesn't replace truth. It clears the path toward it. When we come across an odd stone, a strangely shaped terrace, or a story that remembers something impossibly old, we don't rush to conclusions. We simply open another door. And these doors matter because they encourage us to see history as a field of flickering light rather than a finished painting. They allow us to imagine communities that were small but enduring, ways of understanding the world that didn't build monuments but did build continuity, ways of living that left no stone carvings yet left a direction to follow. From that spirit, we arrive at the final part, seeing civilization as waves, rising, receding, returning in new forms, never beginning at a single point, never ending in a single place. When we look back on the entire journey, from Sunda sinking beneath the sea, Doggerland fading under cold waves, Sahul breaking into islands, the Pacific coast of the pre-Clovis world, the enduring Jomon pottery, the ancient sea routes of Melanesia, the shadowed traces beneath Kambay, the stone terraces of Yonaguni, the andesite blocks at Tiahuanaco, the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, and the quiet shift of the Natufian era, one realization becomes clear. Civilization has never been a destination. It has always been a rhythm, a tide. Some waves build monuments and leave shapes we can still touch. Others leave only the thinnest marks, a layer of ash, a curve in the land softened by thousands of years. Some sweep across whole continents before retreating, and some pass almost without a trace, leaving behind nothing more than a motif preserved in old stories. Every community, brilliant or modest, is a movement in that vast ocean. When a group disappears, what they once understood doesn't vanish with them. It drifts. It settles somewhere else. A way of reading the wind, a method for fishing a seasonal tide, a ritual remembered only in outlines. Sometimes, these are the last echoes of a world that has slipped into shadow. So when ancient lowlands were erased by rising seas, their silence was never proof of emptiness. It was simply a reminder that time hides more than we expect. What remains, a pattern, a carved line, a faint theme in a story, is only the visible crest of something that was once much larger. This journey isn't meant to prove or push a conclusion. It exists to create space, enough space for history to feel less rigid, less locked into a single line. History isn't a straight path. It's a map of countless currents, meeting, parting, recombining. Each current is a possibility. In the end, civilization does not begin from one point. It rises in many places, fades in many places, and returns in new forms. There is no absolute beginning, only emergence. No absolute ending, only pauses. And when we place the final period, we realize even this ending is only another wave, slow, soft, quiet as a breath, until one day, when something inside you stirs, another door will open, and from the deep water of the past, a new wave will rise, continuing a story that time never truly closed.